With Gene Hackman's unfortunate passing recently, Mr. Devine requested that I watch The Conversation. This was a movie written and directed by Francis Ford Coppola as a way to capture the paranoia during the height of the Cold War. And another great example of how you don't have to have a massive scale, big budget CGI fest or crazy high concepts to have a really interesting and well thought out movie. I don't want to go on too long about getting into the meta situation with Gene Hackman before getting into the movie, but he's obviously been in a bunch of classics. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't actually seen that many of them, even though I've of course heard of many of them, like The French Connection, The Quick and the Dead, Unforgiven. For me, the movie that I always think of him from is Hoosiers, a classic sports movie. Something I really like about Gene Hackman that he does really well, including in this movie, is that he manages to be very charismatic while also being kind of reserved and stoic. As much as I like actors like Leonardo DiCaprio or Daniel Day-Lewis or whoever, Christian Bale, I think they tend to be a lot more theatrical and over the top. And I just think there's something to be said, and something I honestly kind of miss in a lot of movies now, for someone who can be entertaining but still seem normal and human. A lot of the characters now that people try to make stoic end up just coming across as bored or bland. Clearly, there's also writing issues there, but I just wanted to say that before we get into this movie. The bulk of the movie centers around one conversation that's recorded by Gene Hackman's character, Harry Call. And he's a really interesting character whose job is to be invasive of people's privacy, record conversations secretly, but is super paranoid himself. And this paranoia was pretty rampant during the time, from my understanding. Almost all of the Cold War took place before I was born. It ended right after. Just to give a quick plot synopsis before I get into the things that I thought were interesting. Harry and Stanley record a conversation between a man and a woman in a public place. He's being paid $15,000 by the director, is what he's referred to as, usually represented by Harrison Ford, who's his assistant. And he's slowly putting together the conversation over the course of the movie, cleaning up the audio quality, getting more words, that whole deal. And as the movie goes on, we find out that in the past he did this in New York, and it led to the deaths of 3 people, causing him to flee to San Francisco. And as he reveals more of the audio, and there's a line in there about he would kill us if he had the chance, he becomes hesitant on whether or not to turn this over because he does feel responsible for what people do with his recordings, even though he says repeatedly it's not his concern. He gets the old honeypot, and a woman steals the tapes, gives them to the director. He has to turn over the photos to get the money, and we find out that the director's wife and man that we saw in the beginning were having an affair. He knows that they're going to be at a certain hotel and room on Sunday, so he goes and gets the room next to him to try to spy on him, and he witnesses a murder, at which point he thinks that the director murdered the man and wife having the affair, but then he sees no evidence when he goes to the room. He flushes the toilet and it's clogged with blood and clothes, and there's a news story about the director dying in a car accident. It's a pretty good twist when you find out that the man and woman were the ones actually killing the director, not vice versa. Harrison Ford was in on it. He's aware of what happened, and he's aware that Harry knows and tells him just to let it go and don't pursue it any further. At which point, Harry rips apart the entire place looking for bugs, even though it was already explained in the middle of the movie that people's phones can be listened to now and how it's done. He ends up in his apartment with just his saxophone, completely destroyed, and seemingly nothing left. So that's a really quick plot synopsis. The plot itself is very simple. A lot of the intrigue comes from the character work. So I want to get into the things that I thought were interesting about the movie. My main criticism would really just kind of be the pacing in the middle. I feel like the middle third dragged a bit more than it really needed to, but it wasn't a huge deal. It just felt a little bit disjointed because of the sudden shift from the focus on the audio to Harry Call and kind of the wiretapping world at large. The part that I thought was the most interesting was probably the dynamic of his job and the people that he's giving the information or the recordings to. He claims repeatedly that he doesn't care what's being talked about. He doesn't care what people do with it. His job is just to be a recorder, and that's it. What they do with the information is their choice. He doesn't give a shit. We obviously see that this isn't true. He struggles with it in confession. It's something he struggles with throughout the movie to the point where he decides that he doesn't want to give the tapes over and they do get stolen. And to me, the movie seems to think that he does have some kind of responsibility, but it's not really his fault what happens. Obviously, one of the big parts of the movie that leads to the really good twist at the end is he misunderstands the message, and it doesn't seem as though him understanding it would have changed the outcome. And he's sort of left with this helpless feeling at the end, obviously, where he couldn't stop the death of the director, and he's kind of past his prime that he can't even figure out how he's being spied on despite how paranoid he is. And obviously the question of how responsible are you for creating things and how they're used is something that's been debated forever. Usually it's done in the context of science. If you invent a new thing and it's used for nefarious purposes, are you at fault? Should you have seen it coming? There's a million questions you can ask, and I don't know if there's really a good definitive answer, especially when it's kind of a case-by-case basis, which recording conversations like this would be. In particular, because he's largely operating without full context, which is what we see in this movie, that leads to the situation that the movie ends in that was unavoidable. I did think it was interesting that his age got mentioned so much, and him kind of losing his touch despite his reputation was a really big part of the plot. We see him get tricked into taking a pen from a guy that's actually recording him, and he's really pissed off about it. We see that he's not paying attention when the guy Moran is explaining how to record someone else's phone line without them knowing. And yet at the end of the movie, he still can't figure out where his place is tapped. And obviously this would be a huge problem as people get older currently. Technology advances so quickly now that it's really easy to fall behind. And we also get a pretty telling scene from this at the beginning where he's got all kinds of locks on his door. He wants the only copy of the key. He's very paranoid. But even his building superintendent has gone through his mail, knows it's his birthday, knows his age. He's just kind of lost touch. Although I do think it's interesting they only made him in his mid-40s, because to me that does seem a bit young to be as out of touch as he is. But if you grew up at the wrong time, for instance, you might not understand anything about Excel, which I would wager most children today have learned growing up. So I don't think it's totally unbelievable. And I do really think the choice to make him as paranoid as he is while his job is to invade people's privacy was really smart. One, because it creates this kind of moral dilemma in him. But two, I think it's perfectly reasonable to conclude that if your job is to invade people's privacy, that knowing how much you can get from that and seeing how it's done would make you extremely paranoid yourself. So I think it's really believable. I thought his paranoia was also interesting because of the sort of self-destructive nature of it. Even the woman he has a relationship with, it's all so secretive and isolated that she just ends it because he's so disconnected and reclusive that they can't have any kind of tenable relationship. The movie does a really good job of his paranoia really being entrenched in his entire life, not just about wiretaps or any one thing in particular. Another thing I found interesting about the movie was the saxophone scenes. To me, it felt like the symbolism of this was the only time that he felt like he could be himself or expressive or kind of put himself out there. And you can hear the applause when he's playing, and obviously music is a very personal thing when you're playing it in particular, really reflective of kind of your mental state and who you are. So I thought that was another nice way to show kind of how his paranoia and reclusiveness impacted him. And one last little thing I want to mention is the kind of use of security cameras. They show the cameras a few times throughout the movie, and they kind of look like the cameras in Metal Gear Solid 2, if you ever played that game. And the way that those old cameras move is they just kind of rotate back and forth. And that's also how the last shot is filmed, where it's just kind of this panning from high up security camera angle. I assume it was deliberate since people actually used to care when they made movies. So I thought that was a neat little thing that I wanted to mention. So I really do think the movie does a lot with a really simple concept of just focusing on one contextless conversation and really one main character. Obviously, the other supporting characters are around, but the focus is Harry. And I feel like I say this with almost all of these older movies, but I'm always reminded by how much they just let you watch the things happening on screen and you understand what's going on. The characters don't narrate what they're doing. They don't look into the camera and quip. They don't do the thinking out loud trope that I'm really not a fan of in general, at least for simple thoughts. And especially because a lot of times the thinking out loud gets turned into a plot device to allow someone to overhear them expressing their thoughts verbally, which I also really hate. And it's just so nice to see just a good, small scale, character driven story. You don't have to try to have a crazy convoluted plot. It's not trying to save the world. It's just about a guy trying to get through his life and do what's right. So I'm going to leave it there for this one. This was a good recommendation from Mr. Divine. You and Jay are really expanding my film knowledge and experience of older movies. If you've seen the movie, let me know what you think. I try responding to the comments that aren't just insults. Like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.